Shalom, welcome, and thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Laura Freedman Pedrick, and I am the board chair of the Touro Synagogue Foundation in Newport, Rhode Island. I am honored to moderate this unique program in recognition of Yom Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Day. We are deeply saddened by the unrest that has occurred in Jerusalem these past few days and fully support maintaining freedom of worship for all faiths. On May 12, 1968, the Israeli government proclaimed a new holiday, Jerusalem Day, to be celebrated on the 28th of Iyar, the Hebrew date on which the divided city of Jerusalem became one, making the day a national holiday. Tonight, we will explore a lesser-known connection between Rhode Island and the building of Jerusalem through the fascinating story of Judah Touro, who was born in Newport. I want to let you know that this program is being recorded. The recording will be kept on the Israel in Boston YouTube and Facebook pages. Before we begin, I would like to thank the Consulate General of Israel to New England for organizing this event, and to the co-sponsors, Touro Synagogue of Newport, Rhode Island, the Rhode Island Israel Collaborative, and the Jewish Alliance of Greater Rhode Island. Now it is my honor to welcome Ambassador Meron Rubin, the Consul General of Israel to New England. Ambassador Rubin's diplomatic career spans over 3 decades, during which he served in 5 Israeli embassies in South America, as well as the positions of Israel's ambassador to the UN and Israel's Chief of State Protocol. Please welcome Ambassador Rubin.
Thank you very much, Laura. It's a pleasure to be with you. As you said just a few moments ago, Jerusalem has never been an easy place to live, but we hope that the violence of the days, the last few days, and I unfortunately think maybe the continued violence until it ends, I hope in the not too distant future, will be short-lived, and we will be able to go back to the beautiful Jerusalem that we all love and enjoy. But I must admit that thanks to Touro's legacy, the Jerusalem that we enjoy today is definitely a better one. And what has been left there by the citizens of Rhode Island has allowed everybody to enjoy the beautiful surroundings of the old city and to see it from such a wonderful perspective, as well as allowing us to have a windmill in Jerusalem. So once again, thank you to everybody for joining this evening. Oh dear, I see that I was talking away and left you without any ability to hear what I was saying. Well, I will quickly go over it again, and I apologize for the 2 moments of silence. As was mentioned by Ms. Freedman, Jerusalem is having a little difficulty, or having difficult times over the last few days. And Jerusalem, with all its importance, has never been an easy place to live. But I think that thanks to the focus made by Rhode Island and the Touro family's legacy, it is definitely a better one and a more beautiful city thanks to what was done, as well as the fact that what we see in Mishkenot Sha'ananim is something that one doesn't usually see in the Middle East, and that is that Jerusalem actually has a windmill. And so I really am happy to be part of this evening's discussion and to hear a little bit more, and to show that shows the importance the United States has had, not only for the development of the state of Israel, but especially the development of Jerusalem over the centuries. Once again, I hope everybody enjoys this evening. Thank you.
Toda Rabbah. Thank you, Ambassador Rubin. Now I am pleased to introduce Rabbi Mark Mandel. In addition to serving as the rabbi of the historic Touro Synagogue, Rabbi Mandel is the director of the synagogue's Hebrew School. He is a graduate of the Yeshiva University Rabbinic Program and has served communities throughout the United States. Rabbi Mandel?
Thank you very, very much, Laura, for being our moderator this evening. And thank you very much to the Israel Consulate of New England for creating this wonderful program with us and with all our sponsors this evening. I'm very honored to be with Ambassador Rubin and his staff, who have done a superb job in creating an Israel atmosphere throughout New England for all of us, whether we're in Boston or in Rhode Island or anywhere in New England. Here at the Touro Synagogue, we're always honored to welcome you. We are the oldest synagogue building in the United States. It's a very historic city. In addition to Touro, we have a beautiful visitor center. Please contact us so that you can participate in this magnificent history, and especially the history that our keynote speaker tonight, Keith Stokes, will share with us, connecting Israel and Middle East to Touro at a very early stage in American Jewish history. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi Mandel. Now we'll hear from Avi Neville, the president and CEO of the Rhode Island Israel Collaborative, a nonprofit which Avi founded in 2016. Avi?
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Ambassador Mebron, Rabbi Mandel, Keith Stokes. It's an honor to participate in this program. In 2010, we took our first mission to Israel, economic mission, and Mishkenot Sha'ananim was a economic project as well. And Keith Stokes at that time told me, you need to look about what Judah Touro did. And since then, we are working hard to connect Rhode Island and Newport to Rhode Island and Newport with Israel and Jerusalem. We had a mission in 2011, 13, 16, and the governor visited in Jerusalem in 2019. And recently we had a virtual economic mission. So we are very proud that we continue something that was started so many 160 years ago. And if we can continue to support, to strengthen those relations, I will be very happy to do so. And just mentioning that Thursday we have an event with the Economic Chamber of Newport talking about technology. Thank you all, and happy Yom Yerushalayim.
Thank you very much, Avi. Our keynote speaker, Keith Stokes, is a frequent national, state, and local lecturer in community and regional planning, historic preservation, and interpretation with an expertise in early African and Jewish American history. Keith is presently vice president of the 1696 Heritage Group, a consulting firm dedicated to helping persons and institutions of color to increase their knowledge and access to the light of truth of their unique American heritage. Keith has a long and distinguished career in business and community development with degrees from Cornell University and the University of Chicago. His past professional positions have included Executive Director of the Rhode Island Economic Development Corporation and Executive Director of the Newport County Chamber of Commerce. We encourage you to send questions to Keith through the Q&A section of this Zoom. Following his presentation, we will have a musical interlude and then return to the Q&A portion of the program. Now I'll turn it over to Keith.
Thank you, Laura. And most importantly, thank you, the Israeli Consulate, and Shalom and Happy Jerusalem Day. It's a great honor and a privilege to be here to provide about 5 centuries of history in about 30 minutes. One of the things that I'm most proud of is also serving as vice chair and the Touro Synagogue Foundation Education Committee, and being a long-term member of the foundation in the work that they've done to present not only the history of Touro Synagogue, but most importantly, the early history of religious toleration and freedom in America. This presentation, which we entitle Faith, Family, and Freedom, begins to talk about the interpretation of the world of Judah Touro himself, and most importantly, what contributed to the man and what helped the man become the great philanthropist as an adult at the time of his death. What we'll do in this presentation is really separate this into 3 segments. 1, family, the family that would build and create a Judah Touro. The second is the faith, how he would maintain his Jewish identity and Jewish peoplehood at a time where most of his life of Judah Touro, there was never a synagogue, a congregation, or even a sizable Jewish community. And then lastly, and most importantly, how this first generation Jewish American would parlay American freedom and present that as a universal freedom for all, regardless of faith, ethnicity, across not only America, but the world and back to Jerusalem. So let's begin going back 5 centuries on a date that most of us should know, but if not, would be known today, which is August 1st, 1492. At that time, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, the Catholic, had defeated the Moors, and they had established through what is called the Alhambra Decree, a decree that anyone and everyone who would remain in now the Catholic Christian Kingdom of Spain would require to convert to Catholicism or would be expelled as heretics. We now know that nearly 200,000 Jews who had lived for centuries, contributing to the economic, social, cultural, and religious ability of Spain and the Iberian Peninsula, were now asked to be removed. And over the next 5 years, between 1492 to 1497, those Jews that would leave to Portugal would also be expelled. And over the next century, Jews from the Iberian Peninsula would flee, creating what is today recognized as the Jewish diaspora, fleeing to Europe, North Africa, and most importantly, to the new Dutch Republic in Netherlands. This becomes a very important country because by the end of the 16th century, this Dutch Republic becomes a major stronghold of not only the dispersed Jews, but Jews who would have the ability to maintain their worship, their commerce, their culture, and identity. And it's these Jews that use the Netherlands as a platform to explore and expand into what at the time would be called the New World. And what we now know is that as a part of this Jewish diaspora to the New World, we know that many of the Jews would largely, during the 17th and 18th century, follow the Spanish, Portuguese, English, and most importantly, the Dutch. We also know that some of the earliest Jewish settlements included Recife at Brazil, Suriname, Curacao, Barbados, Jamaica, New York, New Amsterdam, then becoming New York, and most importantly, our community of Newport, Rhode Island. What's most important is those Jews that followed and settled in Dutch settlements were able to reclaim and retain their Jewish identity and religion. Those that followed Spanish and Portuguese largely converted, which today we recognize as conversos or Moranos. And these early Jews that would settle in the New World in the 17th and 18th century, their most important lead behind is establishing some of the earliest Jewish congregations in places of worship in the Atlantic world. And we recognize them as the great synagogues in Recife, Brazil, Spanish Town in Kingston, Jamaica, Congregation Sharif, Israel, the first Jewish settlement in America at their Mill Street location, Curacao, Barbados, and today, Touro Synagogue, founded as early as 1658 by Congregation Ezra Israel at Newport. And when we begin to talk about the founding of Rhode Island, this begins to have a sense of the world that would create a Judah Touro. In the 17th century, Rhode Island as an English colony is unique. It's unique because it's established under the tenets, which for the first time in an English law and history, a colony is established where there is no official requirement of religion. Anyone could enter the colony regardless of their religious beliefs. Today, we recognize this as religious toleration. In fact, the founding English Protestant Christian settlers, Roger Williams at Providence, and then later Anne Hutchinson, William Connington, and John Clark at Newport, would establish a colony and create a set of laws that would embody a colony that allow for what we today recognize as the liberty of conscience, meaning that anyone could settle here as long as they were a good citizen, paid their taxes, and were obedient to His Majesty the King of England. They could settle here, and they were not required to follow an official religion. I can't tell you in the 17th century how important this was, because this would attract not only early Jews, but also it would have found what is today the Baptist faith in Christianity. The first Jewish settlement and the largest Jewish settlement in the Americas is not Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, but Newport of Rhode Island. But by 1658, a group of Sephardic Jews who had arrived via Curacao, taking a short stop in Barbados, would arrive in Newport and establish Newport's first documented Jewish settlement. 1658 is 4 years after the first Jewish settlement in America at New Amsterdam, what is today New York. We know this because we have primary records of these early Jews that arrive. In fact, they do two very important things during their time in Newport. By 1677, they needed a place for burial. Several of the members had died, and they would consecrate land in the northern edge of town, which is today one of the oldest existing Hebrew cemeteries in North America at Newport, dating back to 1677. The actual deed to that burying ground still exists within Newport City Archives. In 1684, a group of these Jewish settlements were concerned to the fact that they knew that they were tolerated, but they were also concerned of having the Inquisition follow them, because many of them had been escaping the Inquisition from Europe to Curacao to Barbados, and now their concern was that potentially the Inquisition or Inquisition beliefs could follow them to Rhode Island at Newport. So they petitioned the Rhode Island General Assembly and simply said, "We're Israelites. Can we stay? Can we remain here as non-Christian religious citizens?" And the response by the General Assembly was a simple response that said, "They may expect as good a protection here as any stranger, being not of our nation, residing among us in His Majesty's colony, ought to have, being obedient to His Majesty's laws." So what the colony of Rhode Island was saying to these early Jews is that you are tolerated. You are not a part of the majority principal Protestant Christian religion, but you still, as a stranger, are tolerated. You can remain here, and most importantly, you can practice your religion without any royal governor or king or queen oversight. This is an important opportunity for early Jews, because what they were searching for and what they received in early Rhode Island in the 17th century was not religious freedom, it was religious toleration. And because of this tiny colony called Rhode Island at Newport, over the next 100 years throughout the 18th century, Newport becomes the fourth most active seaport in British North America, closely behind New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. But what's most important is that Newport becomes a magnet, attracting all manner of men, women, families, particularly those who had an interest in the maritime trade, to establish themselves in this community. It also became a magnet for Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews from all over the world. If they had any interest in both practicing religious freedom, but also maritime trade, they found their way to Newport. And during that 100-year period we call the Golden Age, at that time, Newport's population was probably 12,000 souls, one of the largest of British North America, and less than 200 were listed as Jews. So still a small community, but large in the context of Jewish settlement in early America. And one of the most important aspects, one of the most possibly unintended consequence of religious toleration in the arrival of these Jews, who were arriving from Spain, Portugal, England, Germany, many through the West Indies, many from Congregation Shereth Israel, New York, would come up to Newport for trade. But what's most important, they bring with them not only their ability to worship freely, they also bring their worldwide commerce and trade. In fact, religious toleration and freedom creates a level of economic diversity and entrepreneurism. And some of the most important early manufactories in early Rhode Island and America are established by these Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews. The introduction of soap making, Cassell soap making, begins initially in Newport and then later in Savannah and Georgia by a James Lucena. Jacob Rodriguez Rivera, who had come from Seville to Newport, his son-in-law and his nephew, Aaron Lopez, who comes from Lisbon, Portugal, via Seville, Spain, arrives, and both of them together establish America's first business cartel, the United Spermaceti Candlemaking Company. And what's important is that as these men arrive and express their ability to worship freely, they allow Newport to engage in worldwide commerce and connectivity that other colonies would have no connectivity to, because these Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews were multilingual. They spoke Spanish, Portuguese, they spoke German, they were Polish. So what's important is that Newport now had connecting ties to a worldwide economy that also included enslaved Africans and slave trade. But what's most important to recognize is that by the mid-18th century, because of these tenets of religious toleration and this diversity in families by religion, by ethnicity, and by race, Newport becomes this very dynamic, interdependent, not integrated, interdependent community. And one of the most interesting aspects of this is that Newport begins to attract some of the most outspoken, progressive religious thinkers of its time. In fact, Reverend Samuel Hopkins, who arrives in Newport, a minister of the First Congregational Church, goes on to become the first American abolitionist fighting against slavery. Reverend Ezra Stiles becomes a Renaissance man who interacts with Rabbi Isaac Carrigal, who is traveling from Palestine across the New World, helping to build Jewish identity and religion with these fledgling early Jewish communities. Rabbi Carrigal spends nearly a year and a half in Newport, learning about Newport, interacting with the Newport Jewish community, and helping a very young 20-year-old early Jewish rabbi, Isaac Touro, who had arrived, to help build a congregation and a place of worship. Rabbi Carrigal helps Reverend Stiles to learn Hebrew and to decipher Hebrew. And one of the most extraordinary series of letters and intercourse between these Hopkins and Stiles Christian ministers and Rabbi Carrigal is that they're talking about and discussing the difference in the Talmud, or in Christianity, the Old Testament versus the New Testament. Reverend Stiles is so taken by this interaction with Carrigal and Touro and the Jewish community. After the American Revolution, he becomes the president of Yale University and makes the decision as president that every senior graduating, instead of providing their graduation dissertation in Latin, it shall be in Hebrew. And today, the Great Seal of Yale, one of the great American universities, is not in Latin, it's in Hebrew. So it's important to recognize is that this interaction between religious toleration and attracting this level of ethnic and religious diversity, unlike anywhere else in America or the world at that time, created in Newport, Rhode Island, this very compact, interdependent living. And I want to be clear the difference between interdependent and integrated. It's interdependent where Christians of different denominations worship separately from other denominations. Jews would worship separately from Christians, but they would largely live, work, and worship on top of each other in this compacted, interdependent community. What men, women, and families, regardless of religion or ethnicity, choose to believe in 18th century Newport is that we won't let religion and ethnicity getting away with economic prosperity. It was truly a melting pot and an early American melting pot. And I want to talk about family now, because this is the environment that a Judah Touro is born into. Judah Touro is born in Newport on June 16th, 1775, right at the very beginning of the American Revolution. He is a part of a first generation of Jewish Americans who were born during the American Revolution. Later, when he relocates to New Orleans, becomes a participant in the War of 1812, almost killed and wounded in service to his country. And then later, it would influence him of becoming, if not the first, one of the first great philanthropists during the early days of America. In fact, in Judah Touro's tombstone, where he is buried in the Hebrew Cemetery in Newport, it is inscribed that the book of philanthropy to be remembered forever. And my discussion today will give you an understanding of the level of family and later freedom that would shape this man, Judah Touro, to become this great philanthropist, because it's his belief in his Jewish religion, it's his Jewish peoplehood through his family that influence him, and then his unique American freedom that gives him the capability and the prosperity to devote literally one of the most important earliest gifts of benefactors of a will in the history of America and much of the world. And to understand Judah Touro, you need to understand the family that he arrives from. The family Touro, as we know, Isaac Touro, who had arrived from Amsterdam as early as 1760, he was brought to Newport by a number of the Jewish leaders in Newport who were looking for a very young rabbi who would help lead the congregation and stay with the congregation. Isaac Touro's family originated in Spain, in fact, in Galicia, Spain. In fact, the small village, which is called Touro, still stands in Galicia. And they eventually would move from Spain to Amsterdam and from Amsterdam to Curacao, the Barbados, and Jamaica. In fact, Isaac Touro has ancestors that go back many generations as major rabbis or Chazzans in Curacao, Jamaica, and Barbados. But this young Isaac Touro arrives as early as 1760. He's just 20 years old. And he oversees, with the Jewish leadership in Newport, the building and completion of the synagogue. By 1763, the synagogue is completed. It's completed on December 2nd for Hanukkah. And the event is a large public event, which includes members of the congregation, Christian community, and elected officials all openly enjoying and participating and celebrating the opening of this Jewish place of worship. Again, this is 1763. Jews and Christians coming together to celebrate and recognize one of the most important events and efforts in early Jewish American history, the completion and opening of their place of worship. By 1773, 10 years later, Rabbi Carrigal has arrived, and he actually marries Isaac Touro to Reina Hayes. The Hayes family are another Spanish family that arrived via Amsterdam and are the earliest members and contributors to Sharith Israel in New York, and then later younger generations relocate to Newport. Over the course of the American Revolution, there's great change in Newport. In fact, because of British occupation, many of the residents, including Jewish residents, leave Newport. Isaac Touro remains to protect the synagogue. The synagogue building is converted into literally a hospital for British soldiers. And at one point, Isaac Touro sends away some of the most precious artifacts and collections to other Jewish families so they'd not be raided and taken by British occupants. By the end of the American Revolution, Newport is devastated by war and by British occupation. Judah Touro and his young family included his first son, Abraham Touro, a daughter, Rebecca Touro, a third son who died 6 months after birth, Nathan, and then certainly Judah Touro. And those children are taken away from Newport, away from war, and they go for a short period of time to Kingston, Jamaica. Why Jamaica? Because Jamaica by the 1780s would have had the largest and most active Jewish settlement in the Western Hemisphere. There were several hundred Jewish families and at least 3 Jewish congregations and places of worship operating in that time. Isaac Touro dies in Jamaica. His body still remains in Jamaica. And his widowed wife, Reina Touro, and 3 young children, ages 11, 9, and 7, returned initially to New York, requesting a pension from the British government, saying that my husband maintained British troops when the synagogue was used as a barracks and as a hospital, and the pension was denied, saying that that is not enough. And our sense was he was a patriot and not a loyalist. So this young widow with her young children had nowhere to go, and she would later move to Boston to join her brother Michael Hayes, and family. And together, the Hayes and the Touro families would become at the time one of the only and largest Jewish family now in Boston. Now, what's important to recognize is that Judah Touro, for the most part, along with his cousins and brothers, are raised in the Hayes household in late 18th century and early 19th century Boston. And I want to give you a sense of what Boston was like at that time, because it's important to recognize Judah Touro's uncle, Moses Michael Hayes, and family had relocated from Newport to Boston by the 1780s, again, escaping the war and the devastation in Newport. And very early on, Moses Michael Hayes, who would be one of the founders of the early King David's Lodge, Jewish Masonic Lodge in Newport, would later come to Boston and become an active member and accelerating and become later the Grand Master of the Massachusetts Masonic Lodge. In fact, Moses Michael Hayes today is recognized as being one of the earliest and most important Masonic leaders in America. In fact, bringing the Scottish rite of Masonic rituals to America. At the time that Moses Michael Hayes establishes himself in Boston, he's also establishing early financial, lending, and insurance businesses. In fact, later to become the Bank of Boston. He's a contributor to Harvard University. He is a contributor to the Latin School. His son, Judah Hayes, and his two nephews, Abraham and Judah Touro, attend the Latin School. Moses Michael Hayes is a leader in Boston, both by commerce and by civic. And in fact, it's his Masonic connections that create unprecedented access to the leadership of Boston. Thomas Treat Paine, Paul Revere are all deputy grandmasters going side with Moses Michael Hayes. And this young Judah Touro is growing up at a time where he's surrounded by some of the most important earliest American patriots, talking about living, fighting, and achieving American freedom. This is the life that Judah Touro is living growing up in early Boston. And I just want to recognize this life and how important it is, because some of the primary documents that we have really begin to provide a snapshot on the influence of Judah Touro and the family, and most importantly, the Moses Mike Hayes family he lived within. One very young boy today who we recognize is Reverend Samuel Joseph May. He's probably more recognized by his niece, who would later become Louisa May Alcott and create Little Women. But Samuel Joseph May would later become one of the earliest members of the Unitarian faith, and most importantly, an early great abolitionist fighting against slavery and run the Underground Railroad activities in both Boston and New York. But as a young boy, he would literally grow up in the household of Moses Michael Hayes and become best friends with Judah Touro and the Hayes children and his cousins. In fact, in his memoirs, he talks about growing up in a household where his uncle and aunt Hayes would raise him, and he would spend weeks of a time living in a Jewish household. But as a young Christian boy, he would still have access to his religious prayers. And most importantly, he would begin interpreting these things going on in the household, like during Shabbat, at the end of Shabbat dinner, Moses Hayes bringing all the leftover food and providing it to the poor of Boston. All these things would influence this young boy, who would later become one of the leading American Unitarian ministers and abolitionists and civil and human rights advocates. And this young Judah Touro, he's trained in Massachusetts by his uncle in the maritime trades. He learns French and spends time in France as a supercargo. And by 1801, as a young man, he relocates to New Orleans. Why New Orleans? Because it's a French possession, soon to be transferred to American ownership. And speaking French, interacting with the French government, and most importantly, having trading connections across New England and New York and Philadelphia with family members and other Jewish community, he would literally be able to come to this wide open frontier called New Orleans and set up, be the sole single trade connection to the known American and known world. Within several decades, because of these strategic, economic, religious, and personal connections, Judah Touro becomes a very wealthy man, a fabulously wealthy man in New Orleans. So let's talk about freedom. Well, first of all, Judah Touro is influenced not only by the life that he lived, he's influenced by his family. His older brother, Abraham Touro, would die nearly 30 years before his brother, Judah. He dies in Boston. He dies tragically. He was going to a parade, and as he was coming back in his little jitney, his horse fell. He fell over. He broke his leg, and through infection, he would soon die. But it's his will at that time where he becomes an early philanthropist. And remembering his community, his congregation in Newport, he begins contributing to congregations and activities in Boston, but he also establishes for the first time $10,000 to the state of Rhode Island for the very purpose of supporting the synagogue and the congregation at Newport. What's most important about that effort is Judah Touro's sister, Rebecca, who was living in New York, goes before the Rhode Island General Assembly and establishes the trust as a legislative act. This is the first time in early American history that a Jewish family establishes a trust that would provide long-term benefits to sustain a Jewish place of worship, a rabbi, and a community. In fact, today we recognize Rebecca Touro as one of the first persons, regardless of ethnicity or religion, to take on the responsibility of setting up a trust fund to maintain a historic building. She is today recognized as one of the first American and Jewish women preservationists. So Abraham, Rebecca Touro, Moses Michael Hayes, all of these family men are influencing a Judah Touro. And as he begins to amass wealth in New Orleans, he's already well before his death making strategic investments. In 1852, Judah Touro, who's quirky, one of the things he would do as a part of his trade, there are cases where he would take on trade and materials, and that included enslaved African Americans. Any time that he took on an enslaved African American, he would free them and set them up with a small dowry. I can't tell you how curious this was and how cautious New Orleans was at him doing this, but he did this on a consistent basis. By 1852, he decided to establish a hospital, an infirmary. And in establishing it in New Orleans, and it still exists today with his name, the Touro Infirmary, he was absolutely specific that this infirmary would provide free care to all seamen, all immigrants, slaves, and any poor person, regardless of race and religion. This is the first time in American history and possibly world history that a hospital is set up to provide free care regardless of race, class, or religion. This is the level of freedom and equality that Judah Touro was practicing in 1852 America. And by the time of his death in 1854, Judah Touro, through his lifetime friendships with Gershom Kershit of New Orleans, Rabbi Isaac Lesser of Philadelphia, these men who had a worldwide view of building not only and sustaining a Jewish America, but also reconnecting Jewish America with the world, and particularly back to Jerusalem, these men would have profound influence on Judah Touro, and both of them would be participants in shaping his will. What's most important is at the time of Judah Touro's death, he left a little over $500,000 to institutions across the country, with more than half of it going to non-Jewish causes. So it's important to recognize what he did for the Jewish community. He would directly support 23 fledgling Jewish congregations in 14 states in America, many who may not have survived or sustained without his contribution. He also gave to Christian places of worship and also gave to hospitals and schools, because Judah Touro, through his will, believed as an American that American freedom should be shared by all, regardless of race, class, or religion. And it would be Sir Moses Montefiore, along with Gershom Kershit, that would work within Judah Touro's will to provide a gift of at least $60,000 to the Jews of the Holy Land, as it was called, to lay the foundations outside the old wall and the new wall for New Jerusalem by 1860. And in fact, it would be Isaac Lesser at the time that would make the famous statement of Judah Touro: his charity, like his friendship, knew of neither sectional nor sectarian boundaries. There's no person like Judah Touro at his time, and possibly no person today, that is largely unknown for his charity and his contribution, but most importantly, his ability to take faith, family, and freedom and parlay that into a product to be shared by all. And I just want to end with a very brief statement by one of Judah Touro's very close business associate, a Catholic Christian man, L.C. Duncan of New Orleans. Both he and his brother were real estate speculators, developers who were closely tied to Judah Touro, and it would be Judah Touro that would influence them on the importance of the Jewish faith, and would actually encourage L.C. Duncan at one point to travel to Jerusalem. And this comes from an actual letter that Duncan would send back to Judah Touro 1 year before his death, where he states, "While I was in Jerusalem, I had the ability to visit the holy city, and I obtained for you what I believe has been regarded among the Hebrews a very precious relic." He took a parcel of earth from the ancient burying ground in Jerusalem, and he brought it back for Judah Touro. And he brought it back because he wanted to present to Judah Touro the importance that you have given me of the universal importance of religious freedom, regardless of religious background. And what's most important is that at the time of Judah Touro's death, his remains brought to Newport with his family and the family of the early Jewish community of Newport, that earth from Jerusalem to New Orleans was carried and placed in Judah Touro's grave. So what does this all tell us? I think it tells us that Jewish history, religion, tradition has survived through the centuries. The good, the bad, and the indifferent, it survives. The story of Judah Touro, it's a story of maintaining faith and family and freedom despite living at a time when Judah Touro's life lived in communities where there were little or no Jewish people, congregations, or observant services, but somehow he maintained his belief and passed it on through his historic will. And most importantly, by uncovering these stories and reinterpreting stories of people of the past, I think it gives us a better appreciation of how and why we will continue to prosper in the present day. It is the story of Judah Touro that should bring us together. And I am honored and privileged on behalf of Touro Synagogue Foundation to provide you this quick but interpretation of this history. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Keith, I want to thank you for this very enlightening presentation. And on a personal note, I have to say, every time I get the opportunity to hear a presentation from you, it's fantastic and I learn more, and I just really appreciate that. So thank you so much. As promised, now we're going to take a break to listen to some live music, and then we'll return for the Q&A. So please keep sending your questions and we will address those a little bit later in this program. Now I would like to introduce Moshe Elmakias. Despite his young age and with a virtuoso personal style, this Jerusalem native appears to be one of the most promising pianists among the new generation of Israeli jazz musicians. He is a graduate of Israel's Academy of Music and has played both throughout Israel and abroad. These days, Moshe studies at the New England Conservatory while performing and recording around the world. It is my pleasure to welcome Moshe.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a honor to be here and to play for you. Jerusalem Day for me is a very special day. I grew up in Jerusalem and I studied in Jerusalem and I spent most of my life there. I also, during my military service in the IDF, I was a tour guide for soldiers who came to Jerusalem, and we spoke about the history and the tradition and the importance of Jerusalem. So for me, it's even more important this day. I think Naomi Shemer described the special environment of Jerusalem in her song Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, and I can definitely identify with each word of that song. So I'm gonna play for you now Yerushalayim Shel Zahav by Naomi Shemer. The next song that I'm gonna play for you is Shabiru Shallam. That song reminds me of the streets of the old city of Jerusalem. When you walk in those streets, you can hear children playing outside. You can hear the muazzin from the mosques. You can hear the bells from the churches. You can hear synagogue singing, and all that blends together to a beautiful music, the music of Jerusalem. Thank you very much.
Moshe, thank you very much. You inspire me to want to go walk the streets of the old city again, so thank you for that. So we do have some great questions, probably more than we can answer in the next few minutes, but I'm going to, is Keith available? Yes, he is. So Keith, if you can help me with a couple of these questions here. The first is, if you could explain again how you distinguish between religious toleration and freedom.
This is very important because the early Jews that arrived to America, particularly at Rhode Island, were not receiving religious freedom, meaning that as Jewish worship, they were free to become full citizens and full participants in Rhode Island government systems. They were just simply looking for a place where they would be safe. And in fact, Rhode Island's Charter of 1663, Royal Charter, specifically states that for citizenship, you were required to be not only Christian, but a Protestant Christian. So as Jews arrived, they were just happy to find a place where they could just worship freely and not look over their shoulder. But by the mid-18th century, as Jewish families and men became established contributors to all of the society of Rhode Island at Newport, many of them were quite frustrated at the fact that they had petitioned to become citizens and they were denied. In fact, by 1762, two of Newport's largest taxpayers, Isaac Eliza and Aaron Lopez, petitioned twice to the Rhode Island General Assembly and Superior Court to be citizens, and they were denied simply because they were not Protestant Christians. So it would be after the American Revolution, Congregation Jesuit Israel, led by their warden, Moses Seixas, would send a very famous letter in August of 1790 to the first President George Washington, asking that will the new United States create an opportunity for religious freedom regardless of religious background. This was very important to not only the earliest congregations of Newport, but across America, because these same men and their sons were very frustrated that they fought the American Revolution, they paid taxes without representation, and did everything a citizen should receive, but still these old colonial charters were restricting their access and participation. So it is after the American Revolution, with the formation of the United States of America embodied in our Constitution, and Rhode Island's own Constitution that would strike down the religious test for citizenship that was initiated by the Jewish communities across America and by men such as Moses Seixas and others in Newport. They then would receive full religious freedom, a difference in toleration, but an important difference that had to evolve.
Thank you.
Great question.
Someone else has said that they saw in Montego Bay, Jamaica, a cemetery with tombstones that had the name Hayes on them. Do you happen to know if this is the same family as Moses Michael Hayes?
No, it is not. I had the chance a few years ago to be invited by the Jewish National Trust of Jamaica, and the largest and oldest Hebrew burying ground is actually in Hunts Bay in Kingston. It's on the waterfront. It's in not very good shape. It's a difficult community, so it took us a while to get there. But we had the opportunity to go through all of the surviving markers. Many have been lost over the centuries. Most of the families that we've been able to retrieve are related to the Touro family, Gomez family, and Lopez family. We had not found Hayes. In fact, Isaac Touro died in Jamaica, but we do not know where his marker even exists anymore. But a marker was built in his honor with the remains of his wife and family in Newport. What's most important is that as we've been going back and working with genealogists across the West Indies and back to Amsterdam and Spain and Portugal, the Hayes name dates back to early Spain and then eventually to Amsterdam. The Touro name, Gomez, Lopez, many of them were Sephardic Jews originating in Spain, and then through the Inquisition, we see them in Portugal for several generations, and then eventually Portugal to Amsterdam, and then following the Dutch, we see them landing and worshiping and now openly practicing as Jews in Curacao, Barbados, New Amsterdam before it became New York, and then later Newport.
Do you happen to know if any of Judah Touro, either of Judah Touro himself or any of his children were ever able to visit Israel, and are there any descendants still alive?
Judah Touro, there is no documentation, primary evidence that he ever left New Orleans during his adulthood or life there. And at the time of his death, he burned nearly all of his personal letters in collections. So what our interpretation of Judah Touro comes from his close associates and friends like Lesser, Kershit, Montefiore, and others. We also have correspondence from cousins that are now largely living in Richmond and Norfolk, Virginia. And again, those are secondary sources. They're not primary sources coming from Judah Touro. So we have no evidence that he ever left New Orleans, and there's no evidence that he ever stepped foot in Jerusalem. We know he was in France for a period of time on behalf of his uncle as a young man, but that's the only dedicated, documented evidence that we have. As far as his descendants, that's an interesting story. I'm a part of that family. We do know through documentary evidence that he did have a child through a relationship with a woman of color, a free woman of color in New Orleans, and his nephew, Gustavus Myers, who becomes the leadest Jewish citizen of antebellum Virginia, also had a son that are part of my family. My maternal grandmother, she and her sisters are the last of our family that were Jewish. She lived and was raised in Williamsburg, New York, when it was a Jewish community in the 19th century. Later Harlem, when it was a Jewish community in the 19th century, and Summer and Newport. But my grandmother and her two sisters, Naomi and Mason, married Christian men. And by 1903, they converted and all became Episcopalians, which I am to this day. But fortunately, the Jewish tradition and histories and collections and artifacts we've still been able to retain, and we're quite prideful of.
That's wonderful. I'm going to ask one more question, the last question of the evening. The Judah Touro lived nearly all of his life in various communities that had little or no Jewish population or active congregation. What are your thoughts about how he maintained his Jewish identity?
Well, it's fascinating to me because there are non-Jewish sources in the 19th and 20th centuries because of his contribution to Christian churches and organizations. They wanted to embrace him as one of our own. So he must have been a convert to Christianity, which is the farthest from the truth. There are no documented evidence of that. And in fact, when we look at his own ship logs and trading logs, while he was in Louisiana at New Orleans, he's trading in kosher beef. He's trading prayer books to outlying fledgling Jewish settlements in the West Indies and back in America. We also know that he is corresponding with his Jewish family members back in New England, in New York, and Philadelphia, and Richmond, Virginia, particularly. But what's most important is that through the letters and correspondence of Montefiore, Lesser, and Kershit, who are bona fide, highly recognized earliest Jewish leaders of America and England, they are talking in detail about Judah Touro's connectivity to his Jewish faith and belief. So while he may not have had an opportunity for a place of worship, he was certainly observant at home. He closed his businesses at Shabbat. We know that, we see it documented. He would not advertise on Friday evenings and Saturdays and not do business at that time. So despite living in a non-Jewish world, his belief, his faith, which is shaped by his family, by his community, by his very being, stayed intact, and to the degree where it would launch itself in his amazing will at the time of his death in 1854.
Well, thank you. I know, as I said, we could go hours more on these questions, but I really appreciate the information that you've shared with all of us this evening. So thank you.
It's an honor.
And I want to thank all of you for joining our program this evening, Faith, Family, and Freedom for Yom Yerushalayim. Thank you again to the Consulate General of Israel to New England, Touro Synagogue of Newport, Rhode Island, the Rhode Island Israel Collaborative, and the Jewish Alliance of Greater Rhode Island for putting this evening together. Please enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.